Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to go through the warrantless arrest affidavit, the unredacted version, which is actually on page 936 of the discovery documents. What I'm going to show you is the redacted discovery in the video, and we're actually going to look at exactly what is redacted in the unredacted version. I also relied heavily on this affidavit to inform the very first book I wrote on this case, Two-Face, the Man Underneath Christopher Watts. And you're going to see the process that I followed and the cues that I followed in terms of the investigation, in terms of what the district attorney were looking at and what they knew early on. In a weird way, the more we've known about the Watts case, in a weird way, the less we've known. I'm going to resume with the deep dive through the evidence, probably tomorrow or the day after. I just want some of the subscribers to sort of catch up with the last episode. I did ask some of my patrons on Patreon a question about the episode that is in store, episode 4, dealing with the basement. I said 2 murder weapons were located in the basement. Which ones do you think they were? And so far, I think a lot of people have gotten the one answer right. So far, no one has gotten the other answer right. And I think it's an answer that's going to surprise most of you. Before we get to today's episode, thank you to the 200 or 300 subscribers who've subscribed in the last day or so. It's good to have you on this channel. Obviously, all your questions and comments are most welcome. A lot of you are very new to the Watts case, so there's a lot of misunderstanding actually in the Watts case, a lot of it due to kind of an excess of information, not much quality information, and that is what True Crime Rocket Science is all about. If you're enjoying the content of this channel, please like, share, leave a comment. If you do share, use the hashtag TCRS. And let's get started. So the first thing to observe in the affidavit is right at the top, the text is sort of missing, and it seems to be saying August 16th, 2018 at, and it looks like 1:45, could also be a 3, I guess, and 20 seconds AM, and I think that's MDT. Under that is another date, August 16th, 2018, 1:50 AM, and this was really the time that Chris Watts was processed at the Weld County jail, and there you see filed in Weld County Combined Courts. But what is kind of interesting with this is we can see that it's quite a long document. We see that this document was being written while Chris Watts was still at the Frederick Police Station. So from around about probably 8 or 9 o'clock, he was kind of left alone. Not really much was happening, but he didn't realize it, but they were actually typing out his arrest affidavit based on what he just told them. And so this is sort of kind of hot off the press, they'd just been written, and all the information was very much at the top of the minds of the people who compiled it, the investigators and so on. And so we're going to go through it. The charges include murder in the first degree, F1, murder in the first degree, F1, murder in the first degree, F1. So that is, they've already established that despite him only confessing to the murder of his wife, he did actually murder all 3 people, and that's how we know it today. Then besides those 3 murder charges, it's also tampering with a deceased human body. That was the whole taking the bodies and disposing of them at the well site. And now we go to Officer James. And so it's actually Officer Matthew James, he was the guy who actually took Watts into custody, took him to the jail, who actually put him in cuffs and all that kind of thing. So the same officer who cuffed Watts also authored this affidavit. So in terms of Officer James, badge number 4698, being duly sworn upon oath, says that there is probable cause for the warrantless arrest of the above-named defendant for the charges stated above, and that the following facts are true and correct to the best of his own knowledge, being Officer James, and belief and support the arrest of the defendant. The crimes allegedly occurred on or about the 13th of August 2018 at 2825 Saratoga Trail. And if you just take that literally, it's saying the crimes in terms of these murders happened, and the tampering of the deceased body happened at 2825 Saratoga Trail. Now we know that the crime also occurred in terms of the tampering of the deceased human body at the well site, and that's not mentioned immediately here. But what they are kind of assuming here is that all three murders occurred in the home, and then they say the suspect was arrested at 11:02 on Wednesday, August 13th. So a very short time. There's some cases where people that go missing, the suspects are never arrested, never charged. If you think of the John Benet Ramsey case, the Madeleine McCann case, the Casey Anthony case, the Gannon Stork case, it took a really long time to bring about arrests, and in some cases there were no arrests. So now we go to the narrative. On August 13th, 2018, at approximately 13:40, Officer Coonrod was dispatched to 2825 Saratoga Trail on a check well being called. The reporting party, Nicole Utoft, called about her friend Shanann Watts. Nicole stated she dropped Shanann off at her residence around 01:48 hours after returning from a business trip that took place in Arizona. Nicole stated Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant and not feeling well during her trip. Now, this kind of thing, this is the big thing, the main reason why Nicole checked on Shanann, because she was 15 weeks pregnant. Now, right in the beginning, we didn't know what to sort of prioritize in terms of the information. But something like someone being pregnant and then disappearing is kind of unusual. And then you've got to ask, was the pregnancy related to that? And you have the same thing with Scott Peterson, who is now facing the possibility, potential of being granted a brand new trial. His wife was almost at full term when she disappeared, and she disappeared just before Christmas. Also, think about how long it took him to be arrested. So this is just extraordinary what happened in the Watts case. Something else just to bear in mind is that Nicole's name is given as Nicole Utoft, and it's spelled incorrectly. It should be Nicole. Nicole Kessinger is Nchol. Anyway, the affidavit spells her name wrong and probably gives her not her current surname, possibly for reasons of privacy. So Nicole Utoft instead of Nicole Atkinson. Also, they're returning from a business trip that took place in Arizona. Nothing is mentioned here about Lavelle or Thrive, which you can kind of forgive the officer for not doing that, but in terms of the true crime narrative, we know that it was quite important. And I'm going to be stressing that in the next episode dealing with the basement. Then later that morning, Nicole became concerned because Shanann was not answering her phone calls, and also missed her doctor's appointment. So there you have the reference to the pregnancy and our doctor's appointment sort of adding to that. And you see that Nicole's concerns totally justified. The fact that she's missed her doctor's appointment may mean that she is ill, that there is something wrong with her. And with the benefit of hindsight, we do know that Watts had poisoned her, trying to bring about a miscarriage. And so just the thing of the pregnancy and this doctor's appointment are actually cutting to the heart of this case. But we didn't know that without the evidence, without the discovery at this point. The doctor's appointment was scheduled for 10 a.m. That's also an error. It was actually scheduled for 10:15 a.m. and that was later corroborated by one of the agents. I believe it was, I think it was Kevin Kobach, but one of the agents kind of followed up on that. And so the appointment was at 10:15. Shanann actually had a alert on her phone for 10:05 for 9:05, and I think at that time she expected to be having dropped the kids off at school if things had gone the way they should have gone, and she would either have been on her way back from that or possibly if she'd sort of hung around. But the distance from the school and the distance from her home was about the same to the clinic. Nicole went to Shanann's residence and discovered her car in the garage with car seats positioned inside of it. That's also not strictly accurate. It was actually her son that confirmed that the car was in the garage. She moved her car in position and her son got onto the trunk of the car and looked in. And so her son Nicholas was actually quite a big help during the investigation. And he seemed to make up his mind before anyone else did that Watts was guilty, that he needed to be investigated, that he was hiding something. It goes on to say Shanann and her husband Christopher have two daughters, Celeste and Bella. Nicole attempted to enter the door, but a latch prevented it from opening more than 3 inches. This is also quite odd for Nicole. The door wasn't usually latched. And so the fact that it was latched was a sign, a possible sign or a hint that Chris Watts was trying to hide something. We didn't know this at the time as well, but Nicole had babysat the dog in the week that the whole family were in North Carolina. And so she knew she had access to the front door. And so this was a way of preventing her from getting access. And this is obviously something done by Chris Watts. Now we go to the second page. Nicole called Christopher Watts and requested he come back home to check on Shanann, as she believed Shanann may be suffering or passed out due to some medical conditions. So this also doesn't, and I mean, the officer, we don't expect him to know this, but there was some knowledge from Nicole's side that she knew things weren't going well with Watts, and him coming home wasn't really necessarily just to check on Shanann. It was to open up the house so that they could check on Shanann. They wanted to do that firsthand, and that's kind of what happened. It turned out that their concern was justified. Shanann wasn't just suffering or passed out. She'd been choked to death and murdered, and she was now no longer at home. And the interesting thing is, Watts being summoned to the scene, while he was being summoned away from where he knew he'd actually left Shanann. Upon arrival, Officer Coonrod checked all windows and doors, including the rear slider door, and discovered all of them were locked with no way into the house. And that's quite an interesting point. If Watts had left any entrance open, it would have opened the door to a possible defense case, either with a intruder who had been able to gain access through an open door or something like that, or that Shanann had just left through that particular entrance or exit. But because I'm not sure if it's mentioned here, but none of these exits had been locked from the out, or how can I put it? It was clear that all of the entrances and exits were locked from the inside, including the front door. And so that showed that Shanann couldn't have left voluntarily. Officer Coonrod contacted Chris and asked for the code for the outside garage door keypad. Chris stated it didn't work, and this is now starting to add a layer of intrigue. So the whole house is locked up, and you can't use the keypad to get into the garage because that doesn't work. So the only way you're going to use it is with the actual remote, if you're present. And this was something that it seemed like Shanann and Chris Watts had argued about in terms of the Vivint. She was quite upset in July that particular thing didn't work, and I think she was upset because she knew that she was not going to be home for a protracted period, and also that he eventually wasn't going to be home. And her intuition was right, because this sensor that wasn't working ultimately allowed Chris Watts to think that he could commit the crime with this little dodgy sensor allowing him to come and go without it giving off kind of an alarm. But also, if Chris Watts wasn't home, it wouldn't allow certain others to get access to the scene. In any event, Chris stated it didn't work and he was only 5 minutes away. That's something that's also not really mentioned here. Is he kept saying he kept changing the time that when he would arrive home, and because he kept changing it, Nicole Atkinson eventually called the police, and it does make one think that Chris Watts wasn't finished with what he was trying to do in terms of the covering up of the crime scene. We know on the way back he still had to drop off evidence and get rid of evidence. So the fact that he kept delaying this time does kind of confirm that whatever he was trying to do away from home, he wasn't finished with. And we don't know whether he intended to do something with Shanann's phone or any of the other possessions. It doesn't look like when he walked in from the driveway, when he arrived and he parked his truck, it doesn't look like he necessarily had her phone with him, but although I suppose that's possible. I think it's unlikely, but it's I guess it's possible. When Christopher arrived, Officer Coonrod entered the home with Chris's consent. That's a very important point to stress, is that if the officer had entered the home without Chris's consent, you'd already have a situation of legal protocol being violated, and that would immediately throw a potential prosecution into some kind of disarray. The other aspect is Nicole Atkinson and her son should actually, by rights, have been not allowed into the house by the officer. Of course, the officer didn't know then what the situation was. I don't think he thought it was a murder. I think he may have thought it's just kind of a domestic scenario that would ultimately resolve itself. But over time he realized that it was quite serious, and so summoned Detective Baumhover. In an attempt to locate Shanann and the two children, Coonrod entered the home and discovered they were not at home. What's also interesting is when all three people enter the home, nobody calls their names. But I think they're taking their cue off Chris Watts, there's almost a subconscious sense of knowing, not knowing, but that he knows where they are, and that they wonder whether he knows where they are. And the fact that he's not calling for them is kind of a subconscious message, well, that they aren't home, and he knows they aren't home. He knows where they are. You know, what is quite interesting when you think about it from just a practical perspective, when Watts arrives at the home, why doesn't he just say to the officer, Shanann told me she's gone to a friend? I'm talking about when he approaches the officer to shake his hand. Why doesn't he just say, Shanann told me she's gone to a friend and she's taken the kids to a friend's house, and then just sort of shrugged, like there's no point in looking through the house because that's where she is, right? But he doesn't do that. Instead, he first goes through the house, pretending to search, but I think actually needing to just cover up this and that. He might have gone into the garage to turn on the router. I'm not 100% sure of that because he got an alert from Vivint saying that someone was at his front door, and surely that was only possible if it was on. So it's unclear what he would have gone and done down in the basement besides let Dieter go. It would be amazing just to have some kind of drone footage following Watts as he went into the house for that minute. Would have been interesting to see what he would have done. When questioned by... So even though he has the story that, well, we wouldn't expect to find Shanann here because she's at her friend, he only reveals that much later on when he's gone through the house himself and realized, oh, they're not here. I didn't know. He's pretending that he didn't know that. So he's kind of, again, doing what is plausible. It is plausible that he would arrive home and look through the house, because that is assuming that he doesn't know where they are. Of course, he does know where they are. So Officer Coonrod questions Watts, and part of that questioning happened inside the walk-in closet, where she said, Shanann didn't move out. She said she would go to a friend, but it doesn't look like she's taken anything. And then more of that questioning happened sort of in the loft area. And then even more questioning happened in the kitchen with a detective present. And then some more questioning and discussion happened at Nathaniel Gymnastics in front of the television. But it started in the closet off the master bedroom. There was also a little bit of discussion in the alcove between the bathroom and the bedroom. So Watts' story, according to this affidavit, was that he said Shanann arrived home from a trip at around 2 a.m. Chris said he awoke up at around 5 a.m. and began talking to Shanann about marital separation and informed her he wanted to separate. So what you see in this affidavit, and this is based on Officer James and Coonrod, their versions, in terms of what Chris Watts said to them, it was that Shanann arrived home at 2 and then he woke up at 5. In this particular version, there's no mention of where he slept or where Shanann slept. It's just that she arrived home and then he woke up at 5 and then he started talking to Shanann. It doesn't say that he sort of woke up and turned to Shanann. It's just that kind of thing. And later on we would discover that he would change this 5 a.m. to 4 a.m. and that's what he said to Coda. So this is his version to the police. His version to Coda was different. It was that he woke up at 4 and started talking to Shanann at 4:15. So anytime you have a version like that where you can't get your time right and your story right, it is cause for concern. So there's another layer that is adding to the concern about it. He said he began talking to Shanann about marital separation and informed her he wanted to initiate the separation. Chris stated it was a civil separation and they were not arguing but were emotional. So this is another layer that is indicating that their marriage is not going very well. What is interesting here is he doesn't say why he wants to separate. He just says that he wants to separate, right? Now, obviously, we know now from the phone data review that there was actually quite a long period of disquiet where Chris Watts wasn't very happy, Shanann wasn't very happy, they weren't communicating very much, and obviously there was a reason for that. But the marital separation didn't just happen that day, and that was something that Coda highlighted. He said the timing doesn't make sense. That on the day that you want to move house and the day that you want to separate, this happens. That doesn't make sense. And he was right about that. The timing didn't make sense. So, where he says it was a civil conversation, that is exactly why I think the crime happened, is because it wouldn't have been a civil conversation. So when Shanann went away on the trip, she was led to believe, misrepresented, that Watts was kind of prepared to consider staying together and working on their marriage and going to counseling. And if he'd said to her, no, I actually do want to get a divorce, there would have been hell. She would have again asked him about that credit card receipt, and she already had a suspicion he was having an affair. If she found out he was having an affair, there would have been an explosion that would have made Nutgate look like a little children's picnic. There would have been Kessinger Gate, which would have been huge, and she would have probably demanded to know who she was, and who knows, called his work, and who knows what would have happened. She possibly would have gone onto Facebook as well, especially if Watts persisted with a divorce and said something about Chris Watts on Facebook, which would have exposed Kessinger in a way that I don't think she would have wanted to be exposed, and that would have been the death knell to their relationship. So it wasn't a civil conversation, and Watts was pretending that it was, and he was pretending that him and Shanann were capable of having a civil conversation about this sort of thing, and very few people, I think, would, given the circumstances. If you were going bankrupt and your wife was pregnant and you were cheating on her, or that was just the situation going on, I don't know of too many human beings who could have a civil conversation under those circumstances. He says they weren't arguing, but they were emotional. And so what he's saying through that is that they quietly and softly had a civil conversation where they sort of whispered to one another so as not to wake the children. Yes, let's get a divorce. Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. I'm not happy about it, but let's... And so they were kind of quietly discussing what they were going to do, and that's just not realistic at all. And that is why I'm certain that they didn't have a conversation whatsoever. Watts knew he couldn't have that conversation, and also bear in mind what he's saying is that he wanted to initiate the separation. So he wanted to formally initiate the separation. Of course, on the Saturday night, he told Kessinger that the divorce was imminent, that they were in the last stages of a divorce, and he was about to move out. You know, it was like a divorce that had been known to Shanann, and Shanann wanted the divorce, and it was kind of on the cards all along. And so this is the big disconnect in the narrative, is that to Shanann, he wanted to just start talking about the separation, whereas to Kessinger, he'd reached the end of that, and now it was about to happen. And so, of course, the divorce happening was actually the murder. And just think about it in a very basic way. This is from an introvert who's not good at these sort of situations. He's convincing his mistress that the divorce is finalized and being finalized, and that is giving her a sense of reassurance. That's something she wants to hear. And in terms of Shanann, he's leaving it till the last moment to actually even deal with this. He leaves it till the very last moment. He does start to bring it up in the last in the last week that they are together in North Carolina, which is the first week of August. But he can barely talk about it, and Shanann seems to conflate it with Nutgate. Is this all about, are you upset about what I said to your parents? And she doesn't realize that it's actually, he doesn't want to be in the marriage anymore. And by the time she does, she thinks she can change his mind. And then he realizes this isn't going to work. He's not going to be able to convince Shanann, especially through that love letter. So he's going to have to take matters into his own hands. That's how he reasons it. So it wasn't a civil conversation, it was a murder. There was no conversation, and there was nothing civil about the murder. And the whole issue was that an argument was what he wanted to avoid. He knew what was going to happen. In the Oscar Pistorius case, there's also a big deal made about the fact that there was no argument, and he didn't even know that his girlfriend was in the room. And so you sometimes have this where you're sleeping and then you have a civil conversation and then there's a murder. Well, what about all the conversations that weren't civil? And we heard about that through Nathaniel Trinastic, saying he did hear arguments, especially just before she went to North Carolina. Chris stated around 5:27 he backed his truck up to the garage door to load up tools and left for work, and that Shanann was in bed when he left. Now, actually I think the GPS shows that it was actually at 5:28 that his car started up. I need to actually confirm that it could actually even be 5:18. Yeah, so just to confirm that, the GPS shows that his truck actually started up at 5:18. So that's also not true. That Chris Watts said that he backed his truck up at 5:27. That's 10 minutes later than he actually did. And I guess the reason he said 5:27 is because if he said he woke up at 5 o'clock, he'd need around about half an hour to get ready, right? And so that is another reason why he adapted the time later on to waking up at 4 o'clock, so that he can then have the conversation, and then this whole thing happens at 5:27. You can understand in terms of the affidavit, if he woke up at 5 o'clock, and he backed his truck up by 5:27. He couldn't have had a very long conversation with Shanann if he also had to get dressed and all that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Okay, so then we go to, he would load up tools and left for work. He said that Shanann was in bed when he left. And so that is what he wants people to think. He wants people to think that Shanann slept, that Shanann was in bed, and that, you know, whatever happened when he left, well, she did whatever she did to the bedding. Now, it was well known to others that although the people asked, was it usual that Shanann wouldn't make up the bed, or was it unusual that she would make up the bed, Watts would say no, but it actually was unusual. Then Coonrod, Officer James highlights a neighbor's video surveillance system recorded this event. In other words, recorded him backing up the truck. Chris said Shanann told him she was going to a friend's house later that day with 2 children, but didn't know the friend's name. Chris, who works for Anadarko, stated he went to a job site near Hudson to check on it. It actually wasn't near Hudson, it was near Roggan. And it is interesting that he says he had to go and check on it. He had to go and check on a job site. Now, he really didn't need to do that. There were others who were actually scheduled to do that. He wanted to check on it. And it wasn't really checking. It was actually disposing of bodies under the guise of checking on something that someone else could have checked on anyway. Note there's not much discussion of the video surveillance system. I guess they were still studying it at that point. And obviously what was left at the well site was from the bed. Shanann's body was covered in a fitted sheet from the bed. So in a weird way, Shanann disappearing from her bed, from the house, in terms of what's a story, in reality, Shanann had disappeared from the bed with something from the bed, and Watts knew that. Then, at Officer Coonrod's request, Detective Baumhover responded to the scene. So, it was while they were at Trinastic that Detective Bormover arrived, and then Watts went to go and speak to him, and for certain reasons, Officer Coonrod wasn't very happy with Chris Watts' version. I don't think Chris Watts is very convincing. There is, right after the first time that Watts shares his version to the officer walks by him out of the closet, and he says, definitely a strange one, or something like that, meaning he's not particularly happy with what he's hearing. And I think one of the reasons why he wasn't happy was, well, why don't you know which friend she went to? Also, the concern of Nicole Atkinson, where she said Shanann always had her phone with her, and Watts saying, well, he didn't know the pin to her phone, or he couldn't log into the banking details. It was just too much that he didn't seem to know, and wasn't very helpful about. So Detective Bormover responded to the scene and arrived at about 2:35. So just barely an hour after Coonrod arrived at the house, and barely 20 minutes after Watts arrived at the house that the detective arrived. That's also incredibly quick. It's incredibly quick that Coonrod requested the detective to be there. It's almost like it was about 10-15 minutes. And so I think also them finding nothing on Shanann's phone. Bear in mind also the phone was found really, really early on, also within about 10 minutes, showed that something was likely up. Upon arrival, Detective Bormover was briefed by Officer Coonrod, and also learned Shanann's personal effects, including her cell phone, purse, wallet, and medication, were located in the house. I think that was the big thing that made Coonrod concerned, and justifiably so. The fact that all of Shanann's things were in the house except Shanann and the kids indicated something was awry, and they certainly were. So it didn't take long to figure out that Watts was full of shit. Upon entering the residence, Bormover observed Shanann's purse on the kitchen island. That wasn't where it was left. People reading this affidavit assumed that wasn't the case. I also didn't think that it was necessarily left by her on the kitchen island. And then a suitcase located at the bottom of the stairs leading to upstairs bedrooms. A pair of women's shoes were located near the front door. So these were the clues that we were given right in the beginning. And you could assume that someone else had put Shanann's shoes where they were. You could assume that Shanann's suitcase was put at the bottom of the stairs by her as well, or that she started ascending the staircase with her suitcase. There were a lot of potential scenarios. Upstairs, Bormover observed the bed in the master bedroom had been stripped of its bedding. This is yet another subtle sign that something could have been wrong. He found it lying on the floor. Coonrod and Detective Bormover both checked the bedding for signs of foul play. And this is where I think a lot of people just miss the plot. So you are now in the bedroom, and if you think this is the murder scene, well, where's the evidence of the murder? And what I mean is, if someone's been murdered in bed, surely there'll be damage to things like sheets, things like scratches, marks on it. I'm talking about if you imagine wrestling with someone on a sheet, a life and death tussle, isn't it going to leave damage to the sheet? Even if you don't tear the sheet, aren't you going to leave the kind of impressions and stress on the fabric that is going to look like something did happen on it? And besides that, if you've had sex on the bed, there's going to be signs of either perspiration. Bear in mind this is in summer. Perspiration, possibly seminal fluid, possibly makeup on the bed, like lipstick and all sorts of other things. And you didn't really have any of that. The bedding seemed fairly clean and fairly, how can I put it, not wrinkled. And they say here they checked the signs of bedding for signs of foul play, but found nothing. So they found no signs of foul play. What I think they did miss was, I think that they missed that some of the bedding was missing, but how would they know that? It's also unclear whether Watts would have run upstairs and quickly covered up, in other words, pulled over, pillow cover, onto the pillows that didn't have pillow covers on them. That's also possible. Because if you find a pillow without its pillow cover on it, aren't you going to notice that? So it's possible he did that when he ran upstairs. It says, in a loft area located between the bedrooms was Shanann's cell phone that Detective Baumhover later learned was found between two cushions of a sofa located in the loft area. This is quite cagily described here, the way that it says was found. Well, who found it? And if if it had gone to trial and it was established that a non-police officer person had entered the scene at the time and actually found the phone, which is a crucial piece of evidence, a defense would have had a field day with that. It was found by Nicholas Atkinson. It was then given to Chris Watts. Then it was given to Nicole, and only after that was taken into custody by the officer. But a lot of this was on the body cam, so that wouldn't necessarily be in dispute. On scene, Detective Baumhover asked Chris to walk me through the period of time when he last saw Shanann. Chris said Shanann arrived home from the airport at approximately 01:48, so he could remember the exact time. At approximately 4 a.m., he informed Shanann he wanted to go through with the separation. So there you can see the change in the time. There you can see in the arrest affidavit an inconsistency. He informed Shanann he wanted to go through with the separation, and they were both upset and crying. Now, bear in mind, he's telling Shanann he wants to go through with the separation, but he tells Kessinger he wants to go through with a divorce, or that the divorce is happening. And he confirmed this during their date on the Saturday night. He said, it's happening, we're getting divorced. Right? There you can see there's a big inconsistency. And as far as Shanann was concerned, he had mentioned divorce a couple of times and mentioned that he wanted to separate, but they weren't, as far as she was concerned, they weren't really in that place yet. Of course, you could argue them being separated for 5 weeks when they were in North Carolina constituted a kind of separation, certainly geographically, but in Shanann's mind, not actually. And when Shanann got back, she kind of actually felt like she'd got Watts back on board in terms of their marriage, that they were going to go to counseling. So she didn't feel like they were getting separated, although she was aware that something was wrong with their marriage in the last days of her life. Chris said Shanann told him she was going to a friend's house that day. Chris said at approximately 5:27, Chris backed his work truck into the driveway to load up tools, and shortly after drove off to a work site near Hudson. Note there's no mention of the video. There's a mention just that there was video footage, but nothing more than that here. Neighbor Nathaniel Trinastich's home video surveillance shows Nicole's vehicle leaving at 01:48 a.m., but it doesn't show it arriving, which is quite interesting. And I think that's quite important to bear in mind, is the home video doesn't capture everything. At 5:20, and so I think the reason it doesn't show it arriving is because it sort of came down the road a certain way and then left a different way. So when it left, it passed in front of the Trinastich home. When it arrived, I think the car arrived and sort of was obscured by the trees. Because she didn't drive all the way up to the garage. She didn't want to wake up the children. At 5:27, Chris Watts' truck is observed backing into the driveway and leaving a short time later. That seems to be an error. I think it's 5:18 based on the discovery, the GPS details in the discovery. Chris provided consent to check Shanann's phone and ultimately surrendered it to allow Detective Mormover to examine it. I think that was a mistake from him, but he was playing the whole game of, well, he's got nothing to worry about, he's innocent, so yes, you can search my house, you can search your phone, you can search my phone, I've got nothing to hide. He was trying to hide everything in plain sight. If Chris Watts had just at that point said, no, you can't search your phone, I'm not sure if they would have gotten a warrant for it, but he could have kept her phone overnight and potentially deleted evidence. Whether he would have done so successfully, we don't know, but we know Kessinger did that quite successfully. If he had deleted evidence of Shanann's phone, I think it would have been quite a hard case to prosecute. Of course, there were a lot of texts to Christina and Addie and her friends that would have provided the other side of the story. I'm just saying it would have been a little bit more problematic to prosecute him without Shanann's phone. Detective Bormover transported the phone to the Frederick Police Department, where it has remained since Detective Bormover collected it. I think that was an early advance in the investigation. When they looked at her phone, they could obviously find that there was marital discord. And him saying that they were getting a separation, I think, was just the tip of the iceberg. And the investigators discovered that. Okay, then it says a neighborhood canvass was conducted for several hours later that evening by patrol, and a check well-being bolo was initiated through dispatch. At 8:14, so the next day, on Tuesday at 7 o'clock, Detective Bormover learned that neither Shanann nor the girls had returned to the residence. Meanwhile, Sandy had actually called Watts just before 5 a.m., the time that she expected him to be awake. 5 a.m., not 4 a.m. She called him and found out the girls were, and then she realized, okay, something serious has happened and he's probably involved, and she's right. She would actually say that I think the girls, that he's hidden the girls in oil, and she's right about that as well. She's also right about the fact that he hadn't shed a single tear over what had happened. And that was the exact words that Tammy Lee would use and would push him to revealing what had actually happened. He realized that was correct, that the fact that he wasn't showing grief did expose him. And he did try and explain that he had hoped that they were okay. But Tammy Lee said that, the polygraph shows that you're lying. Tell us what happened. We know that they didn't leave that house. And that was kind of what pushed him to confess the way that he did. A big breakthrough that made this case turn out the way that it did was Detective Bormover deciding to take initiative and request a press release, and also he asked for the assistance of the CBI and ultimately the FBI. I'm not 100% sure if that's accurate. I kind of get the feeling that the CBI approached him before he approached them, but I could be wrong. That's something I would love the detective to provide clarity on. But the other thing is that he contacted the media, and the media then camped on Watts' porch on Tuesday morning and just put a lot of pressure on him, and ultimately led to him being questioned by the FBI that evening. So the law enforcement watched that interview themselves, and that's where he gave a version, and that also just didn't pass the smell test. The journalists weren't convinced, the public weren't convinced, Kissinger wasn't convinced, no one was convinced. And interestingly, Shanann's mother advised him not to do the interview, and then he did regardless. It would have been interesting if she had advised him to give the interview. Maybe he wouldn't have. So this brings us to the redacted section. A 2-day investigation revealed Chris was actively involved in an affair with a co-worker, which he denied in previous interviews. Now, this is really interesting, is that they say a 2-day investigation revealed this. So they weren't certain on the Monday about Kissinger, but by the second day they did know. And I think they knew because of what was revealed by, I think it was Tony Husky, what they'd found on Anadarko office equipment, computers and so on, that one of their staff was having an affair with another one of their staff. And then obviously Kissinger came forward on the Wednesday, the day of the polygraph. In fact, she came forward while Watts was, not came forward, but she was interviewed by the FBI at around about the same time Watts was giving his polygraph. Now, in terms of the redacted section, am I going to be able to find it now? I think it's page 937. In terms of the redacted section, what is quite interesting is the part that is redacted is "and subsequent polygraph." So I think this is something they didn't want Chris Watts to know, and they didn't want the public to know. The polygraph, this is the redacted section, unredacted, revealed in the discovery. The polygraph also indicated Chris was very deceptive when answering questions regarding Shanann's and girls' whereabouts, and if he had anything to do with their disappearance. And this is this is something we shouldn't underestimate. The polygraph didn't just indicate Watts was deceptive, but very deceptive. And I think Tammy Lee said that I think he scored -18 or something, and I think that's almost like the worst score you can get. So he was a really, really bad liar. And in terms of being able to mask his feelings, and I think that is the mark of an introvert. They don't outwardly show a lot of emotion, but that doesn't mean they don't have emotion. They actually have a lot of emotion, and they try not to show it just because they are so bad at knowing how to deal with their emotions. So they mask their emotions. And obviously he was deceptive about those questions because he did know their whereabouts, and he did know that he had something to do with their disappearance. The fact that Watts took the polygraph and took it in the way that he did just showed to what extent he thought he could just act in a plausible way, in a reasonable way, and get away with it. And why did he think that? And I think the whole MLM thing has got something to do with that, where you constantly telling people to buy products and so on, and it's just words all the time, and no one checks whether what you're saying is true. No one checks whether the whole MLM thing is something that needs to be verified. And because it isn't, you can kind of say whatever you like. But taking that psychology into a polygraph just doesn't work. Then it says, in a subsequent interview, Chris was, and then this is redacted. The unredacted part is, was confronted about his deceptive polygraph. So everything that's redacted here is about the polygraph. and asked to speak with his father, who was present at the police department. Chris said he would tell the truth after speaking with his dad, and this is reaching the last section of the affidavit. After being allowed to speak with his father, Chris stated after he told Shanann he wanted a separation, he walked downstairs for a moment and then returned to his bedroom to speak with Shanann again. Now, what I want to emphasize here is what's actually confessed to his father before he confessed to anyone else. And it's unfortunate from his perspective, from the Watts perspective, from the defense side of things, that his father didn't just stop him and say, we need to get a lawyer, stop talking, let's get a lawyer. Instead, his father essentially interrogated him. His father essentially interviewed him what happened, and he told his father everything. And I think they were dumb enough to think that if they spoke very softly, if they sort of whispered and spoke very softly, it wouldn't be picked up in this room. And of course they were wrong. But the amazing thing was, even after they'd whispered it, the law enforcement, Code and Lee, entered the room and they then confirmed what was said. Of course, it was only half true, and that's been the case all along. Everything Watts has said has been half true. Some of it's true, some of it's not true. But what is the part that's true? And so this is quite interesting. He tells his father he told Shanann he wanted a separation, then he walked downstairs. Now, let me just emphasize this, and it's the same thinking I took into the first book I wrote, The Man Underneath Christopher Watts, is in his confession to his own father, his story is that he tells Shanann he wants a separation, and the next thing is on the stairs. He goes downstairs, and while he's on the stairs, he's on the stairs for a moment, and then he returns to the bedroom to speak to Shanann again. Now, we know he didn't speak to Shanann. So what actually happened there? Well, something happened. He was on the stairs, and then he went to the bedroom to speak with Shanann again. No, he didn't go to speak to Shanann again. He went to retrieve the bedsheet. While in the bedroom, he says, via the baby monitor located on Shanann's nightstand, he observed Bella sprawled out on her bed. So it's almost like he goes into the bedroom and he goes to Shanann's side of the bed, but she's not there. So what does he do? He looks onto the baby monitor. None of this is true, but this is his story. And then he observed Bella sprawled out on her bed and blue, and Shanann actively strangling Celeste. So literally what he's saying there is he sees Bella sprawled out, and he sees that she's blue in the baby monitor, sees that she's dead. He doesn't see her in the flesh blue, but sees her in the baby monitor. And then I guess the camera cycles over to Celeste's room, and then he sees Shanann there. And then Chris immediately goes into a rage. He doesn't go and check on Bella. He doesn't check on Celeste either. He doesn't pull Shanann away from Celeste. He just sort of instantly strangles Shanann. That's his story. And I think it was Tammy Lee said Chris Watts' face lighted up when they presented him the idea, did Shanann do something? And I think he wanted to put the blame on her, but he also wanted to be the good guy. The fact that they offered him, that they were going, well, do you think it could be her? And he thought, wow, if they think that, I'm going to go with that. That's what he didn't realize they were playing him. Anyway, he says he went into a rage, and that is the same thing he would say in his second confession, that he went into a rage. And this is, again, where people missed the point. This wasn't a rage, spontaneous killing. It wasn't that he had sex with her and then just decided to kill her. It wasn't that he'd planned to kill her before she arrived home, before she'd even gotten onto a plane. Even on the Friday when he was speaking to his colleague about Survey 319, he was planning it. He'd been planning it and thinking about it for quite a long time. according to him, I think what he said to Cheryl and Cadel is that he'd been thinking about Shanann's murder for 2 weeks or for weeks. Anyway, he ultimately strangled Shanann to death, and that makes complete sense because it was a silent death. She wasn't stabbed, she wasn't shot, the neighbors didn't hear anything. And in this version where he says he strangled Shanann to death, there's also no shouting or crying or anything. Bella doesn't cry out when she's strangled, according to this version. Celeste doesn't cry out when she's strangled, and Shanann doesn't cry out when she's strangled. It's a silent death, even in his version of it. And I believe the reality is that as well. It was a silent death. We know that the neighbors heard nothing. Chris said he loaded all 3 bodies onto the back seat of his work truck. Yes, he did. No one was running around. Maybe the camera was seeing shadows, but there's a reason for that. And I'll go into that in due course. He said he loaded all 3 bodies onto the back of his work truck. Now, bear in mind, he knew that they had the Trinastich video. So if he knew there was video of him not loading the 3 bodies into the truck, why wouldn't he say so? Why would he admit to that? He's admitting that he loaded all 3 bodies because in his version, his first version, all 3 people were dead at the house. That's true. And took them to an oil worksite identified as Survey 319 with GPS coordinates 4.21 and minus 104.366. And that is where the bodies were dumped, and I'm going to be dealing with that in a deep dive, but exclusively on Patreon. The Survey 319 site now no longer exists. All the infrastructure there has been removed, which I think makes poetic kind of sense in the way that this case has been also just put in a drawer. Everyone stopped talking about it. Chris said he buried Shanann near 2 oil tanks and dumped the girls inside the oil tanks. Now, that statement led to a lot of discussion. I kind of suspected that Shanann was buried right beside the tanks, like literally very close to them, with the idea that maybe he was going to put her remains inside the tanks shortly after or sometime after. I didn't imagine that she was buried as far away from the tanks as she was. When it was said that the sheet was found, I thought she was wrapped in the sheet and they were kind of like rabbit ears, or just a small quadrant or a small triangle of the sheet was protruding out of the ground, and this is what they found. It just didn't compute that he would simply leave the sheet lying outside. It just didn't make any sense, but just shows you Watts was kind of not in his right mind. He was, I think, sleep deprived. I think he was addicted to Kissinger, and that addiction had addled his brain. He just wasn't thinking straight. In terms of the dumping the girls in the oil tanks, no one could sort of imagine that it was through the thief hatches. This confused a lot of people because it just didn't seem possible. It really just didn't seem possible. And I'll talk about some of the evidence around the tanks in the deep dive. Chris Watts was presented an aerial photograph of the tank battery and identified 3 separate locations where he placed the bodies. And they were like A, B, C. And when he was asked, why didn't you call 911 or whatever? He said, I didn't know what to do. I was in a panic. And no one believed him, and no one should have believed him. Prior to Chris's confession, investigators arrived at Survey 319 with consent. That's consent from the owners of the property, and then also doing all the getting the red tape done with Anadarko to initiate a drone search of the area at approximately 4:15 p.m. And I believe this was on Wednesday. Wednesday afternoon, at 4:15 Wednesday afternoon, so shortly after the polygraph, and the same day that Kissinger had spoken to them, so quite early on. And it's unfortunate they don't mention the exact date here, but investigators spotted a bed sheet in the field near the tank battery. Now, the fact that it says field there, I think, does indicate that it's not that near to the tank battery. Of course, you'd need a picture of the tank battery to see where the field was and to know that there was a cleared section of dirt. The sheet matched the pattern of several pillowcases and a top sheet recovered from a kitchen trash can from the Watts residence early that day. So the pillowcases and top sheet were recovered on Tuesday in the kitchen trash, not on the Monday. I don't know whether they didn't look in the kitchen trash, but it's possible that they didn't. I don't know whether when they checked the bedding for foul play, whether the pillowcases had already been stuffed into the trash, but I somehow suspect that they were. They had been stuffed in there by then, not when Chris Watts did his run through of the house, but shortly after committing the crime. I also think Chris Watts going into the kitchen and then coming back out, the idea was to get them into the kitchen and then get them out again so that they wouldn't linger in the kitchen and look around, because that was where there was some evidence. And if they'd found that evidence in the kitchen trash then, I think he could have been arrested on the Monday. The search was conducted with prior consent provided by Chris. This is referring to the search on the Tuesday. If Chris Watts had just not consented all along, it could have made things a lot more difficult. The drone search also revealed fresh movement of dirt consistent with a clandestine grave near the oil tanks. Now, at the time that this was signed, at the time that this was written, Shanann's body had not yet been found, but the sheet had been found and the disturbed patch of dirt had been found. And then shortly after this, it was around about just after midnight, just after he was arrested, they did find her body. And it would take another day to find and retrieve the children's bodies. Even though they opened the hatch and shone a torch inside the oil tanks, they couldn't see anything. Okay, so I'm not going to take things further than that. I will continue with the deep dive through the evidence probably tomorrow. I'll only be, from now on, providing a 5 to 10 minute preview for those on YouTube. If you want to watch the full hour-long episodes, that will cost you $1 on Patreon. There's a lot of other content, of course, on Patreon, and a very nice, intelligent, well-mannered community there, full of true crime rocket scientists. So if you want to join True Crime Rocket Scientists, head to Patreon/TCRS. I'll also be putting up another video on YouTube dealing with the Facebook that the Netflix documentary depicts as Shanann's Facebook account. I think that's going to surprise a couple of people. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you do share, please use the hashtag TCRS. And I'll see you guys next time.